They called it the Devil's Dog, a 150-pound Neapolitan Mastiff, black as a closed casket, with a jaw that had crushed bone, and a temper that had sent 3 grown men to the emergency room in a single year. It belonged to Connor Valdez, the kind of name that didn't get spoken out loud in most parts of Chicago, unless you wanted trouble finding you before morning. At 36, he'd built an empire that rivals couldn't survive, and that dog Nero was the only living thing on earth he'd ever trusted. So when Nero disappeared for 3 weeks without a trace, Connor turned the entire South Side upside down looking for it. When it finally came back on its own, thinner, dirtier, but alive, something had changed. It wouldn't let anyone near it anymore. It'd growl, snap, bare its teeth at anyone who wasn't Connor himself. Everyone figured the dog had gone feral, but they were wrong. Because one morning, while Connor was walking Nero through a rough stretch of South Side, the dog ripped the leash from his hand and bolted full speed. No warning, straight toward a filthy sidewalk where a woman lay curled under a sheet of cardboard. Nero didn't bark, didn't growl. It lowered its massive head and lay down beside her, gentle, careful, like it was guarding something it had already lost once and wasn't going to lose again. Connor stood there, and for the first time in 20 years, the most dangerous man in Chicago didn't know what to do. Because when he looked at that woman's face, really looked, he saw a scar on her forehead he'd memorized as a boy. He saw the way her lips pressed together, even in sleep, exactly the way they used to when she was trying not to cry. He saw his mother, and she was dying on a sidewalk in his city, and his dog had known before he did. If this story's already got your heart racing, hit that like button so more people can find it, share it with someone who needs to hear this, and subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The night a 16-year-old boy stood at his mother's door and realized he'd never be enough. Connor Valdez wasn't always the name that could make all of Chicago fall silent. There had been a time when he was only a thin little boy sitting on the steps of a small, modest apartment in West Garfield Park that his mother was struggling to keep, waiting for her to come home from work. Dorothy Valdez gave birth to him when she was only 26 years old, in a public hospital where the walls were peeling and the nurses were too busy to smile. His father, Gordon Valdez, was the kind of man who knew how to say all the right things but didn't know how to stay. And when Connor was 8, Gordon disappeared on an ordinary Tuesday morning, leaving behind nothing but an empty closet and 3 months of overdue mortgage payments. Dorothy didn't cry in front of her son. She waited until he fell asleep, cried in the bathroom with the faucet turned up loud, then woke the next morning at 4 o'clock to clean office buildings before her shift at the grocery store began at 9. 2 jobs, 7 days a week, and she never complained once. To Connor, she was his whole world. She taught him to read with books she bought on sale at the Goodwill thrift store. She taught him how to cook because she said a man who knew how to cook would never have to depend on anyone. And she taught him a sentence he remembered even now, though he didn't want to remember it. She said men didn't need to be strong. They only needed not to give up. 4 years after Gordon disappeared, when Connor was 12, the phone rang at midnight. Dorothy picked it up, listened, and then collapsed onto the kitchen floor. Pauline Crane, her best friend from high school, the only person who still called her every week, had died in a car accident on Interstate 55. Pauline left behind Wesley, 4 years old, with no father, no relatives, and no one willing to take him in. Dorothy didn't hesitate. She signed the adoption papers for Wesley within 2 weeks, because that was what Pauline would have done for her if their places had been reversed. Connor understood that. He didn't hate Wesley. He even helped his mother feed Wesley during those first weeks. When the little boy cried all night because he missed his mother and couldn't understand why she wasn't coming home. But Wesley was frailer than ordinary children. He got fevers often, fussed often, needed twice as much attention, and Dorothy had only 2 hands and 24 hours in a day, half of which had already been sold to 2 jobs. She was exhausted, and in that exhaustion, she began to divide things without realizing she was dividing them. Wesley needed more attention because Wesley was weaker, and Connor was strong. Connor could take care of himself. Connor understood. That was her reasoning, and she believed in it because it was convenient. When Wesley needed new shoes for the school year, Dorothy bought them. When Connor needed new shoes, she said the old pair could still be worn. The soles only needed to be glued back on. When Wesley brought home a test with a decent grade, Dorothy hugged him and said she was proud. When Connor brought home a test with the highest grade in the class, she nodded, then turned and asked whether Wesley had eaten yet. Connor saw all of it. He wasn't jealous of Wesley. He didn't hate that 4-year-old child who had lost his mother, because he knew what it meant to lose a father too. But he was jealous of something else, something a 12-year-old boy didn't know how to name but felt clearly, like the cut of a knife. He was jealous of the version of his mother that Wesley received, the patient version, the gentle version, the version that was always there, the version Connor had once had entirely to himself, but now had to share, then had to surrender, and in the end, no longer received at all. And the most painful part wasn't that Dorothy loved Wesley more. The most painful part was that she didn't even realize she was doing it. 4 years passed that way, slowly and steadily, like water wearing stone down, and Connor learned how not to ask for anything. He didn't ask his mother to attend parent-teacher meetings because he knew she would say Wesley needed her at home. He didn't tell her when he was bullied at school for wearing shoes held together with glue because he knew what the answer would be, that he was strong, that he could handle it himself. And he did handle it himself, not because he was strong, but because he had no other choice left. The year Connor turned 16, his math teacher asked him to stay after class and told him he was qualified to apply for a full scholarship to a pre-college program, a program for outstanding students from low-income families, funded by a private education foundation in Illinois. Connor applied without telling anyone, because he had grown used to doing everything without telling anyone. 3 months later, the acceptance letter arrived in the mailbox, and it was the first time in his life he held something in his hands and felt that it had real weight, a full scholarship, a 2-year program, books, tuition, room and board, everything paid for. It wasn't only an achievement, it was an escape route, proof that he existed, that someone out there saw him even when his mother didn't. The scholarship ceremony was held on a Saturday afternoon in the auditorium of a university in downtown Chicago, Connor told Dorothy 2 weeks before. She nodded and said she would come. He believed her, not because she had never broken a promise, but because he needed to believe in something, and this was the last thing he still had. That Saturday morning, Wesley woke up with a slightly sore throat and a forehead that felt a little warm. No high fever, no vomiting, nothing that 1 Tylenol and a glass of orange juice couldn't fix. But Dorothy placed her hand on Wesley's forehead, frowned, then told Connor she thought she should stay home and watch Wesley, just to make sure, and that Connor understood. He was grown now, he could go by himself. Connor stood at the apartment door, wearing the neatest clothes he owned, a white shirt she had bought him 2 years earlier that was now tight across the shoulders, and black dress pants that were a little short at the hems because he had grown taller since she bought them. He looked into the bedroom and saw Dorothy sitting beside Wesley's bed, her hand resting on the little boy's forehead, her mouth murmuring something gentle that he couldn't hear clearly, though he didn't need to hear it clearly to know. And in that moment, everything became clear with a kind of cruelty. It wasn't that she didn't love him. It was that her love for him was never large enough for her to choose him when she had to choose. He could earn the highest grade in the class, win a full scholarship, cure cancer, or go to the moon, and she would still sit beside Wesley's bed because Wesley had a runny nose. He went to the ceremony alone. He sat among other families, parents taking pictures, hugging their children, crying because they were proud, while the chair beside him stayed empty. When his name was called, he stood, walked up to the stage, shook hands, received the certificate, smiled the way he was supposed to, then walked back down and sat again beside the empty chair. No one knew, no one needed to know. He went home that afternoon without saying a word. He walked straight into his room, took his old backpack, packed a few sets of clothes, the book his mother had bought him when he was little, the scholarship certificate folded into quarters, and $42 he had saved from helping carry goods for the grocery store at the end of the block. Dorothy saw him carrying the backpack toward the door and asked, in the same ordinary voice she used every day, "Where are you going?" Connor stopped. He turned back to look at her, and Dorothy saw something in her son's eyes that she had never seen before. Not anger, not resentment, but the calm of a person who had made his final decision and had nothing left to lose. He said, his voice even and soft, "Somewhere I don't have to wait for anyone to choose me anymore." Then he walked through the door. Dorothy called his name. Her voice rang through the stairwell, bounced off the concrete walls, and chased him down step after step. Connor heard it, every syllable, but he didn't turn back. Because if he turned back, he would see her cry. And if he saw her cry, he would stay. And if he stayed, he would keep sitting beside that empty chair for the rest of his life, waiting for someone to choose him who never would. On the first night outside that apartment, Connor slept on a bench at the bus station on Pulaski Road, his backpack tucked under his head, $42 stuffed inside his sock. He was 16 years old, with no valid identification, no relatives, no phone number to call, and the scholarship certificate folded into quarters in his coat pocket couldn't buy him even one meal. He never used that scholarship because enrollment required the signature of a guardian, and he had just walked away from the only guardian he had. Chicago wasn't gentle with children who wandered alone. During the first week, he washed dishes for an Italian restaurant in Bridgeport, where the owner paid cash at the end of the day and didn't ask his age. During the second week, he loaded goods for a warehouse in back of the yards, where no one cared who he was as long as his back could still hold out. By the third month, he had begun running errands for men he was smart enough to know weren't ordinary businessmen. Packages without labels, envelopes without names of recipients, deals made in parking lots at 2 o'clock in the morning. He didn't ask what was inside the packages. He didn't need to ask. He only needed to survive. And to survive in Chicago at 16, with no diploma and no family, he had to accept that the line between legal and illegal was far thinner than he had imagined. At 18, he was arrested for the first time, for possession, and was released after 4 months because the witness recanted. At 21, he already had men working for him, not because he was more brutal than the others, but because he had something most of them didn't have: patience. He remembered what his mother had taught him, that men didn't need to be strong. They only needed not to give up, and he applied it to a world she never could have imagined her son would enter. He didn't give up. He climbed, slowly, steadily, and without trusting anyone. At 24, he met Finnegan Shaw in a cheap bar in Canaryville. Finn sat at the far end of the counter, drinking bourbon alone, his eyes fixed on empty space in the way of men who had seen too much and couldn't forget any of it. A former Marine, 2 deployments in Afghanistan, he had come home with a medal and nightmares every night. No job, no family waiting for him at home, no reason to wake up in the morning. Connor didn't remember exactly what they said to each other that night, but he remembered that Finn was the first person who looked at him without wanting anything from him. Not money, not favors, not power, only another glass of bourbon, and someone who wouldn't ask him how many men he had killed. Connor bought Finn that bourbon. Then the next one. Then, in the year that followed, Finn became his right-hand man, the only person allowed to speak straight to his face without having to worry about the consequences. The Valdez Empire grew quietly, like tree roots spreading beneath concrete, unseen until the sidewalk began to crack. When Connor was 31, on a rainy night, he went to inspect a scrapyard the organization had just taken over in Englewood. Inside, among piles of rusted iron and old tires, he heard a weak growl. A puppy, a Neapolitan Mastiff, jet black, so thin every rib could be counted, lay curled in a dark corner. It had been abandoned there for no one knew how long enough to growl at anyone who came near, long enough to learn that human beings weren't something to trust. Finn wanted to call animal control. Connor didn't answer. He sat down on the cold cement floor, about 2 meters from the dog, and did nothing at all. He only sat there. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes, while rain drummed against the corrugated metal roof, and Finn stood behind him thinking the boss had lost his mind. Then the puppy stood, its legs trembling, walked toward him 1 step at a time, and lay down beside his foot. No one told it to. No one lured it. It chose for itself. Connor looked down at the small, bony creature trembling beside him and saw something he recognized instantly because he had lived with it for 20 years. A creature that had been thrown away, full of anger, but still choosing to step toward a stranger because it hadn't completely given up believing someone might stay. He named it Nero. 5 years later, Nero weighed almost 70 kilograms, and in Chicago's Underworld, it was nearly as famous as its owner. When Connor brought Nero to a meeting, everyone understood that the meeting wasn't meant for negotiation. When Nero growled, someone was about to disappear. But the people who feared Nero didn't understand the thing only Connor knew. Every night, when the mansion fell silent and the underworld slept, Nero lay beside his bed, its head resting on his foot, and Connor talked to it, not about business, not about money or territory, but about the things he didn't say to any human being. Nero was the only creature on this earth that knew Connor Valdez, the man all of Chicago feared, still kept in his wallet a scholarship certificate folded into quarters, yellowed with time. While Connor Valdez was building an empire from the ashes of his childhood, on the other side of the city, a woman was falling apart in the opposite direction. The night her son walked out the door, she stood at the top of the stairs calling his name until her voice gave out. Then she sat down on the steps and stayed there until morning because she believed he would come back, believed that a 16-year-old child could only go so far before he had to return home. But he didn't come home. The next day, she went looking for him, asking the neighbors, asking his classmates, asking the owner of the grocery store at the end of the block where he used to help carry things. No one knew. She went to the police station to file a missing person report, and the officer on duty looked at her with the tired eyes of someone who had seen too many children run away from homes in that neighborhood and said they would make a note of it, but she shouldn't expect too much. She printed flyers with the money that should have been used to buy books for Wesley, taped them to light poles from West Garfield Park to Humboldt Park, with trembling handwritten words, "Looking for my son, Connor Valdez, 16 years old, gray-blue eyes." No one called, not one phone call. Weeks turned into months, months turned into years, and she never stopped looking toward the door every time she heard footsteps on the stairs, even though she knew they weren't his footsteps, because she knew his footsteps by heart, and she didn't hear them for 20 years. Wesley grew up in that apartment, graduated from high school, went to college with the money she had saved all her life, money from 2 jobs, money from lunches she had skipped, money from winters when she didn't turn on the heat, so the gas bill would be a few dollars lower. Wesley graduated, found a job, got married, moved away, and the distance between him and her widened in a way she didn't recognize until it had grown too wide to close. He called every month, then every quarter, then only on holidays, and each call was shorter than the one before. Then one day, he came to visit her, carrying a stack of papers and a smile she wanted to believe was sincere. He said she was old now, that managing money at her age was complicated, that he would take care of her. She only needed to sign here, power of attorney, so he could manage things for her more conveniently. She signed. She signed because she trusted him, because he was the child she had given everything to keep, the child she had chosen instead of the other one, and she needed to believe that choice hadn't been meaningless. 6 months later, the apartment where she had lived for decades was sold. The savings account was empty. Wesley didn't answer the phone. She went to his house in the suburbs of Indianapolis, rode a Greyhound bus for 3 hours, knocked on the door, and his wife opened it, looked at her with cold eyes, and said Wesley wasn't home and she should call first next time. She never went back again. She wandered the streets of Chicago for months, sleeping on park benches, under church awnings, anywhere there was a roof when it rained. Tommy Brewer, the owner of a small diner on the South Side, sometimes brought her a box of leftovers at the end of the day and told her she should go to a homeless support center. But she didn't go because she no longer had enough will left to do anything except survive one night at a time. Then one night, in the dark alley on the South Side where she had been lying for weeks, she heard heavy breathing at the mouth of the alley. A huge black shadow stood there, larger than any dog she had ever seen, its eyes glinting in the streetlight spilling in. Anyone would have been afraid, but she wasn't afraid because she had already lost everything, lost her son, lost her home, lost her money, lost even the child she had chosen. And when a person has lost everything, fear becomes a luxury no longer needed. She looked at the dog and said, her voice hoarse like gravel rubbing together, "You're lost too, aren't you?" The dog didn't growl. It came closer, sniffed her, then lay down beside her. That night, she slept warmer than she had on any night in months. For the next 3 weeks, the dog stayed. She didn't know whose it was, didn't know where it had come from, only knew it was the first living creature in this world, willing to stay beside her without needing her to give it anything. She talked to it every night, telling it about the son she had lost, about the gray-blue eyes she had last seen 20 years earlier. about the scholarship ceremony she hadn't attended, about the 20 chocolate cakes she baked every year on his birthday, and then sat eating alone. The dog lay and listened, its head resting on her foot, and she believed it understood, not because it understood language, but because it understood loneliness. But she grew weaker. She coughed more, ate less, found it harder to stand. One night, she looked at the dog sleeping beside her and knew she couldn't keep it there, in that alley, beside an old woman who was about to die. It deserved to go home to its person, even if she didn't know who that person was. She whispered, "You don't belong here. Go back to your person." Then she waited until it was deeply asleep, quietly crawled away, slowly, painfully, over every meter of sidewalk, to another street corner farther away, where she lay down and pulled a piece of cardboard over herself. When the dog woke and saw she had disappeared, it searched for her, but she had gone too far. In the end, it did the only thing it knew how to do. It returned to the place it belonged, back to Connor Valdez, but it carried something with it that it couldn't leave behind. Her scent, her voice, the memory of her trembling hand stroking its head every night, and the pain of a creature that knew it had left someone behind. That woman's name was Dorothy Valdez. And now we return to that moment, on a sidewalk on the south side of Chicago, where Nero had just lain down beside the woman under the piece of cardboard, and Connor Valdez was standing there, looking down at the face he had tried to bury for 20 years. He didn't fall. He didn't scream. He only stood there, and the world around him vanished. The traffic, the wind, Abel calling boss from behind him, all of it sinking into a silence so thick it felt like water filling his lungs. His legs buckled, not because he decided to kneel, but because his body did it before his mind could stop it. Both knees struck the dirty sidewalk, and his hand, the hand that had signed orders ending so many lives, the hand feared by traffickers across the entire Midwest, that hand lifted and trembled. He touched her shoulder, gently, as though he were afraid she might break, and perhaps she really might, because beneath that filthy cloth there was nothing left but bone and skin and a faint, fragile breath, trying to cling to a life she herself no longer wanted to keep. He said only one word, his voice breaking in a way no enemy had ever heard. "Mom." She didn't respond right away. Her breathing remained shallow and slow, her eyelids fluttering slightly, like someone dreaming who didn't want to wake because reality was too heavy to carry. Then she opened her eyes, slowly, dimly. Eyes that had lost most of their light looked up at the sky with the gaze of someone long accustomed to seeing nothing worth looking at. But then her eyes met the gray-blue eyes looking down at her, and in one instant, 20 years collapsed. She knew those eyes. She had searched for those eyes in every crowd she had passed through for 2 decades, on buses, on streets, in dreams, especially in dreams. Her lips moved, and the name she breathed sounded more like wind slipping through a crack in a door than a human voice. "Connor," Nero whimpered softly, a small sound from deep in its throat. Then it laid its heavy head on her stomach, with a tenderness almost impossible to believe, from a beast weighing nearly 70 kilograms, one that had once sent 3 grown men to the hospital. It lay there, eyes closed, as though at last it had completed the thing it had been trying to do ever since it left that dark alley, bringing these 2 people back to each other. Behind them, Abel Kent came running, his hand already gripping the gun inside his jacket, because any unusual situation involving the boss could be a trap. But when he came close enough to see Connor Valdez kneeling on the filthy sidewalk beside an old homeless woman, his hands trembling, his face deathly pale, he stopped, as if he had slammed into an invisible wall. 7 years working for Connor. 7 years watching him handle everything from betrayal to bloodshed without changing the rhythm of his breathing. And Abel had never seen an expression on the boss's face like the one he saw now. He had no word for it, because it wasn't anger, it wasn't fear, it wasn't pain, but all of those things at once, compressed behind a mask that was beginning to crack in tiny lines. Connor didn't look at Abel. He took off his cashmere coat, a coat more expensive than everything Dorothy had owned throughout her entire life combined, and draped it over his mother. Then he pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and said 4 words in a voice no one would dare argue with. "Miriam, right now." Then he gave the address. While they waited, he said nothing else to Dorothy. She looked at him, her lips moving as though she wanted to say something, but he didn't look back at her. He looked at Nero. He looked at the dog lying on his mother's stomach, and in his mind, every missing piece from those 3 vanished weeks fell into place. Nero hadn't gone wild. Nero had found her, had stayed beside her, had carried her scent and her pain back home, and when it growled at everyone, it wasn't because it hated them, but because none of them was her. The car arrived within 15 minutes. Miriam Santos, the organization's private doctor, stepped out with a medical bag, looked at the scene before her, and was professional enough not to ask a single question. Connor lifted Dorothy into his arms, and she was so light he almost lost his balance because he had prepared himself for the weight of an adult. But what he raised felt only as heavy as a child. He placed her in the back seat. Nero immediately jumped in and sat beside her, and Connor got into the front seat. His face shut down, completely. Like the steel door of a safe locked with a code he wasn't even sure he still remembered. Abel slid into the driver's seat, glanced through the rearview mirror, saw the boss sitting motionless and staring straight ahead, and understood that even if he worked for Connor Valdez for another 20 years, he would never be allowed to ask about what had just happened on that sidewalk. Connor's mansion stood in Lincoln Park, 3 stories tall, with red brick walls and a security system worth more than the apartment Dorothy had lived in for decades. Miriam Santos examined Dorothy on the sofa in the downstairs living room, while Connor stood in the hallway, looking through the narrow crack of the half-open door. Miriam didn't need much time to reach a conclusion. She was severely malnourished, in the early stage of pneumonia, dangerously dehydrated, her blood pressure low enough to be life-threatening, and if she had spent a few more weeks out there, she would have died. Not possibly died, but certainly died. Connor listened and said nothing, then turned away. He ordered Abel to prepare the downstairs guest room, the room at the end of the back hallway, with a window looking out over the garden, wide enough, warm enough, with a bed, a wardrobe, and a private bathroom. It was the room used for overnight guests, not the master bedroom, not the upper floor where Connor lived, not a place meant for family, and that was a deliberate choice. He saved her because she was his mother, and he wasn't the kind of man who would let his mother die on a sidewalk, but he didn't forgive her, and the distance between the downstairs guest room and the upstairs bedroom was his way of saying that without having to open his mouth. Dorothy was bathed, dressed in clean clothes, given fluids through an IV, and fed thin porridge because her stomach had shrunk so much it could no longer tolerate solid food. She lay on the clean white bed, her eyes open but not truly seeing anything, like someone who had just been pulled from the bottom of the water and still couldn't believe she was breathing. Nero lay on the floor beside her bed and didn't leave, and when Abel tried to come close to place a glass of water on the nightstand, it growled and forced him to step back 3 paces. That afternoon, Connor entered the room. He pulled a chair from the corner wall, set it 2 meters from the bed, sat down, and looked at Dorothy with eyes that held nothing but control. Dorothy looked at him, and she saw the face of the 16-year-old boy from long ago, inside the face of the 36-year-old man before her. The same jawline, the same gray-blue eyes, but everything soft had vanished, replaced by something hard and cold, like steel, tempered through fire too many times. She wanted to say, "my son," but those 2 words caught in her throat because she didn't know whether she still had the right to use them. Connor spoke first, his voice flat and precise, the way it was when he gave orders in business meetings. "You'll stay here until you're well. Miriam will take care of you. You'll have food, medicine, and a place to sleep. After you recover, I'll arrange somewhere else for you to live. We don't need to talk any more than necessary." Dorothy opened her mouth. "Connor." He cut her off immediately. One single word, sharp as a blade. "Don't." Then he continued, slower, but not any softer. "Don't say my name, as if you still have the right." The room went so quiet that Nero's breathing could be heard. Dorothy didn't argue. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She only looked at him, and in her eyes there was something Connor recognized but refused to admit, because if he admitted it was real regret, he would have to face the possibility that she had suffered, and if she had suffered, then the story he had told himself for 20 years, that she didn't care, that he had left and she hadn't even bothered to look for him, would collapse, and he couldn't bear to have one more thing collapse. He stood, pushed the chair back into its place, walked to the door, closed it behind him, then leaned his back against the wall outside the hallway and shut his eyes. Inside the room, Dorothy lay on the clean, white bed in the million-dollar mansion of the son she had lost, and she cried, without sound. Tears slid down both sides of her temples and soaked into the pillow, and her hand clutched Nero's fur, clutched it tightly, as if the dog were the only thing keeping her from falling into the abyss whose edge she had stood on for 20 years. Nero didn't move. It let her cling, let her cry, lying still like a black stone beside the bed. And that was more than anyone had given her in all those years. Half an hour later, Finn entered the mansion after finishing business outside. He found Connor sitting in the study on the second floor, pouring whiskey but not drinking it, only staring at the glass. Finn closed the door, stood in front of the desk, and asked directly, without circling around it, because that was how he had operated for 12 years. "Who is she?" Connor didn't answer right away. He looked at the glass of whiskey, looked at the afternoon light passing through the amber liquid, and stayed silent long enough for Finn to understand that the answer coming next wasn't the kind of answer anyone could treat as ordinary. Then Connor said, his voice low, almost without breath, "My mother." Finn Shaw, the man who had survived 2 deployments in Afghanistan, the man who had watched comrades die in front of him and still gotten back on his feet, the man who had followed Connor Valdez through life and death for more than a decade without ever asking too many questions, stood there and didn't know what to say. Not because he had nothing to say, but because he understood there are moments when any words would be too much, and this was one of them. In the days that followed, Connor left the mansion early in the morning and came home late, sometimes not coming home at all, as if Dorothy's presence in his house was something he could only endure by keeping a physical distance from it. And during the hours when he was gone, Dorothy lay in the downstairs guest room, too weak to go far, but awake enough to observe. And what she saw told her more than any conversation Connor would never allow her to have. The mansion was beautiful, beautiful in the way she had only ever seen in magazines in hospital waiting rooms, polished oak floors, a marble kitchen, furniture whose names she didn't know, but knew for certain that each piece cost more than an entire year of her wages back when she was still working. But there were no photographs, not one photograph on any wall. No family pictures, no pictures of friends, no memories. Nothing to show that a real human being actually lived here instead of merely existed. No paintings on the walls except 2 black and white abstract pieces that she suspected someone else had chosen for him, not Connor himself. No green plants, no bookshelves, no half-eaten bowl in the sink or pair of shoes left crooked in the hallway. None of those small signs that a person lived somewhere and didn't simply sleep there. Everything was expensive, perfect, and hollow in a way that chilled her. From her room, she heard footsteps moving back and forth in the hallway. Heavy, steady, always someone there, 24 hours a day. One morning, when Miriam opened the door to come in and examine her, Dorothy briefly saw a man pass behind her, tall, wearing a black suit, and beneath the suit jacket was the unmistakable outline of a gun tucked at his side. She said nothing, but she saw. Another day, when she was strong enough to walk into the hallway to use the bathroom, she passed Abel Kent, standing there talking on the phone. His back was turned to her, his sleeves rolled up, and she saw the long scar running from his wrist to his elbow. Not a surgical scar, but a cut, the kind of mark she knew didn't come from an accident. Abel turned around, saw her, immediately pulled his sleeve down, and lowered his head. He said nothing, only bowed his head and walked away quickly. And that bow told her everything. That in this house, the name Connor Valdez wasn't the name of a man, but the name of a force everyone feared. She began to fit the pieces together. The mansion had no warmth because its owner had built it like a fortress, not to live in, but to keep anyone from getting inside. There were no family photographs because he had no family, or rather, because at 16 years old, he had decided he didn't need a family. No one dared come close to him because he had turned himself into something people could only fear or obey, never love. And that was the price, she realized with the cruel clarity of a mother seeing the wound she herself had made. The price he had paid to never be abandoned again was becoming a man no one dared get close enough to abandon. Miriam came every day, checking her blood pressure, adjusting her medicine, making sure she ate enough meals. She was a practical woman, one who didn't ask much, didn't judge, but also didn't pretend this situation was normal. After a few days, when Dorothy was well enough to sit up and eat rice, instead of lying there with fluids dripping into her veins, the two women began to talk. At first about medicine, about meals, about things that didn't matter. Then gradually, like water finding its way through a crack, Dorothy began to tell the story. She told Miriam about Wesley, about the child she had adopted because of a promise to her dead best friend, about how she had poured everything into him, believing she was doing the right thing, believing Connor understood, that Connor was strong, that Connor didn't need her as much as Wesley did, about how Wesley grew up, graduated, then tricked her into signing a power of attorney, sold her home, took the money, and vanished from her life as if she had never existed. Miriam sat and listened without interrupting, the stethoscope still in her hand, though she had forgotten she was supposed to be examining her. Dorothy looked down at her hands, those thin fingers woven together in her lap, and spoke in a dry voice, without tears, because she had cried all her tears for this long ago. That was my punishment. I chose the wrong child. I gave everything to the one I thought needed me more, and the one who truly needed me, I abandoned. And when I lost everything, the one I abandoned never came back, while the one I chose threw me into the street. Miriam said nothing for a long time. Then she placed her hand over Dorothy's, lightly, only for a second, just long enough for Dorothy to know someone had heard. That night, Miriam wrote everything down in her personal notebook. Not because she intended to tell Connor, she understood her boundaries in this organization, but because she knew that sooner or later, he would ask. And when he asked, she wanted to have the exact answer, not a blurred memory. Because Miriam had worked for Connor long enough to know one thing, he didn't ask until he was ready to hear. But when he did ask, he needed the truth, all of it, without a single detail missing. On the 5th night after Dorothy was brought back to the mansion, Connor returned close to midnight after a meeting in Pilsen that had lasted longer than expected. He stepped into the house, nodded to the night guard, took off his coat, and went up the stairs toward his room on the 2nd floor. The downstairs hallway was dark, with only the glow of a nightlight spilling through the crack under Dorothy's door at the end of the hall. And he passed it the way he did every night, without stopping, without looking, without admitting that behind that door was the woman who had given birth to him. But tonight, he heard her voice, not crying, not calling out, a voice, small, hoarse, slow, the kind of voice used by someone telling a story to someone else without expecting an answer. She was talking to Nero. Connor stopped, not because he wanted to listen, but because his feet stopped on their own before he could order them to keep moving. Dorothy's voice slipped through the crack in the door, thin and light as smoke. The first year after he left, I thought he'd come home. I saved him a portion of dinner every night, put an extra pair of chopsticks on the table, then sat there waiting until the rice went cold before I cleared it away. You know that? I did that for a whole year, every night. And then one day I realized I was talking to an empty chair. Nero lay still. She could hear its steady breathing, and she went on. Then his birthday came, his 17th birthday. The first year he wasn't home, and I didn't know what to do. I stood in the kitchen at 5 o'clock in the morning, looking at the oven, and I thought, if I bake a cake, maybe he'll smell it, somewhere out there. He'll smell the chocolate cake and remember the way home. She gave a small laugh, dry and thin as paper about to tear. I know that was foolish, but I still baked it. I baked the chocolate cake because when he was little, chocolate cake was his favorite. Every time I baked one, he'd sit in front of the oven and look through the glass, waiting for the cake to rise, and his eyes would light up. You know that? Those gray-blue eyes would light up like he was seeing something magical for the first time. Outside in the hallway, Connor stood motionless, his back against the wall, his eyes open but seeing nothing except the darkness and the memories he had built walls around for 20 years. The memory of chocolate cake in that small kitchen, of the old oven with a crack in one corner of the glass door, of his mother's hands in oven mitts pulling the tray out, and of how he had to wait 10 minutes for the cake to cool but never could. So he always burned his tongue, and his mother would laugh, truly laugh, the kind of laugh he hadn't heard again in 20 years, not even in his dreams. Dorothy's voice continued. I lit candles. I sang Happy Birthday. I sang it alone in the kitchen. Then I sat down and ate the whole cake because there was no one else to eat it with. Every year it was the same. 17, 18, 19. Every single year until 36, I baked 20 chocolate cakes, lit candles 20 times, sang alone 20 times. No one ate any of them. No one heard me sing. It was only me and the empty chair and the cake. I wished he was sitting there to eat. Then she fell silent. Nero breathed evenly. The room became quiet again. And outside in the hallway, Connor Valdez, the man who ruled half of Chicago's underworld, the man hired killers called Sir, the man who hadn't shed a single tear since the night he walked out of the apartment in West Garfield Park, closed his eyes, and tears fell. Without sound, without words, they simply fell, running over his cheekbones, along the jawline hard as stone, down onto the collar of his shirt, and he didn't wipe them away because his hands no longer obeyed him, because his entire body was doing the thing he had forbidden it to do for 2 decades. For the first time in 20 years, something inside him broke open, not loudly, not dramatically, just broke, like a load-bearing wall that had endured too long and finally cracked, not because someone struck it, but because it had grown tired on its own. He didn't enter the room. He didn't knock. He didn't tell her he was there, less than 2 meters away from her, hearing every word, crying over 20 chocolate cakes he had never known existed. But he didn't leave either. He stood there in the darkness of the hallway, his back against the cold wall, caught between Connor Valdez, the Mafia boss the entire city feared, and the 10-year-old boy who had once sat in front of the oven, waiting for the cake to rise with shining eyes. And he no longer knew which one of them he was. Connor Valdez wasn't the only person in Chicago who knew how to exploit an opponent's weakness. Perry Knox, 52 years old, a former Drug Enforcement Administration agent for 14 years, before being fired for involvement in the disappearance of 30 kilos of cocaine from the evidence room, had spent the rest of his life building his own network on the south side of Chicago with the very skills the federal government had taught him. Knox wasn't as strong as Connor, wasn't as rich as Connor, didn't command loyalty from his men the way Connor did, but he had something Connor didn't have: the patience of a man who knew how to watch and wait for his target to make a mistake. And for the past 2 years, Knox had been waiting. He carried people on the inside, not inside the Valdez organization, because that organization was sealed tight as a safe, but in the surrounding area, delivery workers, maintenance employees, taxi drivers, small eyes no one noticed, but eyes that saw all kinds of things. When a strange woman was brought into Connor Valdez's Lincoln Park mansion in a black car at midday, and afterward Connor's private doctor appeared with a medical bag, that information reached Knox within 48 hours. Knox didn't hurry. He had his people verify it, find public security camera footage, compare images, and within a week, he had the answer. That woman was Dorothy Valdez, 62 years old, Connor's biological mother, homeless, without property, without relatives in contact, and she had disappeared from every system more than a year earlier. Knox smiled when he read the report, the kind of smile belonging to a man who had just found a crack in a wall everyone believed couldn't be broken. The next morning, a brown envelope with no sender's name was left in front of Connor's mansion gate. Abel picked it up, checked it for bombs, checked it for white powder, found it clean, then brought it inside to the boss. Connor opened the envelope in his study, with Finn standing beside him. Inside was a photograph. It showed Dorothy curled on the sidewalk beneath a piece of cardboard, thin, filthy, exactly where Connor had found her. But the angle and the light showed this photograph had been taken before that, maybe days earlier, maybe weeks, which meant Knox had known where his mother was before Connor did, and had done nothing, only taken a picture and waited. Beneath the photograph was a piece of white paper with a handwritten line in black ink, neat, each stroke clear, as if the writer wanted to make sure not a single word could be misread. Even dogs know where their mothers are, Valdez. Do you? Connor looked at the photograph, looked at his mother lying on the sidewalk in his enemy's picture. His hand gradually tightened, his fingers clenching, and the photograph crumpled in his palm. Finn watched and knew he was looking at the most dangerous thing that could happen in Chicago. Connor Valdez truly angry. Not the cold kind of anger he used to control his empire, but the hot kind, the kind he had buried deep since the night he left his mother's home, the kind that, once it flared, no one, not even Connor, knew where it would stop. Finn said, "Knox is testing the fire. He wants you to act hot and make a mistake." Connor didn't answer. He set the crumpled photograph on the desk, smoothed it flat, looked at it one more time, then stood and walked out of the room. 2 days later, Knox made his move. 3 men came to the Lincoln Park mansion at 10 o'clock in the morning, while Connor was at a meeting in the West Loop. They arrived in a van disguised as belonging to a plumbing company, parked 1 block from the gate, and approached from the back through the alley leading into the garden. Abel spotted them first, thanks to the security cameras catching unusual movement near the rear fence. He reacted within 90 seconds, pulled 2 guards on duty into position, and when Knox's first man cut through the fence and slipped inside, Abel was already there, waiting. The gunfight happened fast, no more than 3 minutes, the suppressed gunshots sounding like a hammer driving nails in rapid succession. Abel took down 2, while the 3rd man turned and ran through the alley before the 2nd guard could cut him off. Inside the mansion, Dorothy didn't hear the gunshots because her room was at the end of the downstairs hallway, far from the rear garden, and the guns were suppressed. But she heard Nero. The dog leapt off the floor, stood in front of her bed, facing the bedroom door, growling, a deep sound from its chest that shook the wooden floor beneath it, and it stood there like a living wall, 70 kilos of muscle and fangs, ready to tear apart anything that stepped through that door and wasn't Connor Valdez. Dorothy curled up on the bed, not understanding what was happening, but she looked at Nero standing between her and the door, and she knew this dog would die before letting anyone touch her. 15 minutes later, Connor received Abel's call. He listened, didn't say a single word, stood up in the middle of the meeting, and drove home at a speed that treated red lights as suggestions. Connor walked into the mansion 12 minutes after Abel's call, his face calm in the way Finn had long ago learned was the most dangerous sign of all. Because when Connor Valdez was truly angry, he didn't shout, he didn't slam his fist on a table. He became so quiet that the air around him thickened like the air before a storm. He went straight to Dorothy's room before doing anything else, before asking Abel for details, before checking the cameras, before looking at the 2 bodies in the garden that his men were waiting for orders to handle. He opened the door to her room and saw her sitting curled up on the bed, her back pressed against the wall, both arms wrapped around her knees, trembling, not from cold, but because she had heard Nero roaring, and she had lived long enough on the streets to know that when a dog growled like that, something very bad was coming very close. Nero was still standing in front of the bed, not yet lowered, ears raised, eyes fixed on the door, and only when it saw Connor step in did it slowly sink down and lie on the floor, like a guard finishing his watch. Dorothy looked up, saw Connor, and the first thing she said wasn't to ask what had happened, wasn't to cry for help, but, "I should leave. I'm causing trouble for you." Connor looked at her, looked at the thin 62-year-old woman shaking on the bed in his house, the woman he had picked up from the sidewalk a week earlier, the woman he had sworn he would never forgive. And in that moment, instead of anger, instead of coldness, instead of the flat voice he had used with her since the day he brought her home, something else rose inside him, older, deeper, more instinctive than anything he had built over the last 20 years. He said, his voice low and firm, not the voice of the boss giving an order, but the voice of a man drawing a line that anyone would die for crossing. "This is my house. No one touches anything in my house." He didn't say she was his mother. He didn't say he would protect her. He said anything in my house. And in that moment, perhaps for the first time since he had brought her home, he unconsciously included her on the list of things that belonged to him, along with this mansion, along with this empire, along with Nero. Dorothy heard that sentence and didn't know how to react, because it wasn't forgiveness, wasn't love, but it also wasn't indifference. It was something in between, something she had never heard from him before, and she didn't dare name it because she was afraid of naming it wrong. Connor turned away, closed her door, and went straight upstairs to meet Finn. The 2 men sat across from each other in the study, the door closed, and for 20 minutes, they planned. Not a plan to kill Knox, because killing Knox would create an all-out war, would draw the attention of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, would set off an endless chain of revenge. Connor wanted something worse than death. He wanted Knox alive, alive while losing everything, and knowing exactly who had taken it all. At 10 o'clock that night, Connor went to the harbor warehouse in Calumet Harbor, where Knox kept his goods and cash. Finn had been working since the afternoon, disabling the security system, bribing 2 warehouse guards with 10 times their yearly pay. And when Connor walked in, Knox was already sitting there on an iron chair, both hands tied, duct tape over his mouth. wearing the expression of a man who still couldn't believe this was happening to him. Connor pulled over another chair and sat across from Knox, close enough that their knees almost touched, and he didn't shout, didn't hit him, didn't draw a gun. He talked. He told Knox that while Knox was sitting here, Finn was moving every shipment in the warehouse to another location, that the 6 bank accounts Knox had hidden in the Cayman Islands had been frozen 2 hours earlier thanks to a federal judge Connor had owned for a long time, that Knox's 3 main distribution lines had been cut, every important link receiving a call tonight with 2 choices: switch over to Valdez or disappear. That Knox's 2 closest men, the men he trusted most, had taken money to open the warehouse doors tonight, which meant Knox no longer had anyone left to trust. Connor said all of it in an even voice, slow, neither high nor low. Then he stood, pulled the tape from Knox's mouth, and said the final sentence before leaving. "I'm not killing you, Knox. I want you alive. Alive long enough that every morning when you wake up, you look around and see there's nothing left. No money, no men, no power, nothing at all. And you know I'm the one who took it all, because you dared touch what's mine." Connor left the warehouse and drove back to the mansion close to 2 o'clock in the morning. He entered the downstairs bathroom, turned on the faucet, and washed his hands. Not his blood, but blood that had clung to him from the warehouse floor, where the 2 guards had been dealt with by Finn earlier, after changing their minds at the last minute. He washed until the water ran clear, then stepped back into the hallway. When he passed Dorothy's room, he stopped. The door was slightly open. Inside, she was asleep, her breathing slower and steadier than it had been in the first days. Nero lay on the floor beside the bed, its head resting on its front paws, eyes open and looking toward the door, seeing Connor standing there in the dark. It didn't growl. It only looked at him, then slowly closed its eyes, as if it knew that tonight no one would get past either of them. The morning after Knox had been dealt with, Connor sat in his study, a cold cup of coffee on the desk, and called Finn in. He didn't look up when he spoke, his voice flat, as if he were reading a grocery list. "Find me everything on Wesley Valdez, 28 years old, possibly living in the Indianapolis area, adopted son of Dorothy Valdez. I want to know where he is, what he does, how much money he has, where that money came from, and I want it within 48 hours. Finn didn't ask why, because he had heard enough from the scattered pieces over the past week to put the picture together himself, but he asked one question before leaving. "Do you want me to handle him, or just find information?" Connor looked up for the first time. "No, I don't want anyone touching him. I want something else." 40 hours later, Finn placed a file 2 centimeters thick on Connor's desk. Wesley Valdez, 28 years old, living in Carmel, a suburb of Indianapolis, Indiana, in a 4-bedroom house with a backyard and a 2-car garage, purchased in cash 14 months earlier. A BMW 3 Series bought new. His wife's name was Brooke, 26 years old, a former Purdue University student, currently not working. No children. Wesley worked for a small financial consulting company in downtown Indianapolis, with an average salary not enough to explain the house, the car, or the bank account balance of nearly $200,000. Where that money had come from didn't require Finn Shaw to figure out. It came from Dorothy, from the apartment she had lived in for decades, which Wesley had sold for $160,000. From the savings account she had spent her whole life filling, all of it legal on paper, because Dorothy had signed the power of attorney. But legal and right were 2 different things. And the last line in Finn's report was what made Connor sit very still for a long time. Wesley Valdez knew Dorothy Valdez was currently homeless in the Chicago area, according to confirmation from a call Tommy Brewer placed to Wesley's phone number 3 months earlier, a call that lasted 2 minutes and 17 seconds, after which there were no follow-up calls from either side. He knew. He knew his adoptive mother was living on the streets, eating leftovers, sleeping under a piece of cardboard. And he knew it 3 months before Nero found her. And he did nothing, didn't call back, didn't send money, didn't drive 3 hours from Indianapolis to Chicago just to at least look at the face of the woman who had raised him. Did nothing except continue living in the 4-bedroom house bought with her money. Connor closed the file gently, and that gentleness was more frightening than any fury. He didn't need violence for Wesley. Violence was something he reserved for enemies worthy of standing across from him. and Wesley didn't deserve even that. He called Judge Warren Holt, 67 years old, a man Connor had held in his hand for a long time, thanks to undocumented loans and secrets. The judge very much wanted kept hidden. The call lasted 4 minutes. Within 2 weeks, a federal financial fraud investigation was opened against Wesley Valdez, using the very power of attorney he had tricked Dorothy into signing as the central evidence. Exploitation of an elderly person's finances, elder financial abuse, a charge the American justice system was punishing more severely with every passing year. The house was frozen. The bank accounts were frozen. The car was seized. Brooke, Wesley's wife, saw the news about the investigation, consulted a lawyer, and filed for divorce within 10 days. Because Brooke wasn't a bad person, but she also wasn't someone willing to sink with a ship that was going down. Wesley lost everything, not in one night, but over 2 slow weeks, one thing at a time, exactly the way Connor wanted, slowly enough for him to feel each piece slipping out of his hands. And when it was all finished, Connor mailed Wesley an envelope. No note, no threat, only one thing inside, a photocopy of the yellowed scholarship certificate Connor had received at 16, the day Dorothy had chosen to stay home and take care of Wesley instead of attending the ceremony for her biological son. Wesley would understand, or he wouldn't. Connor didn't care. Dorothy found out 3 days later, when Miriam accidentally mentioned that Connor had ordered Finn to investigate someone named Wesley, and that name drained the color from Dorothy's face. She waited for Connor to come home that evening, and when he passed her room, she called him in a trembling but clear voice. "Connor, let me speak." He stopped, but didn't enter the room, standing at the doorway with his shoulder against the frame. Dorothy looked at him. "What did you do to Wesley?" Connor answered, his voice neither rising nor falling. "What he deserved," Dorothy said, her voice higher now, not shouting, but trying to keep herself from breaking. "He's my son too." Connor looked at her, and in the pale yellow glow of the night light, his eyes weren't cold and weren't warm either. They were only truth, naked and merciless. "I, the one you didn't choose, am the one who picked you up from the sidewalk. The one you chose knew you were dying in the street and couldn't be bothered to drive 3 hours to look at you even once." Dorothy didn't answer. She couldn't answer, because there was no word in the world that could argue against that truth. She sat on the bed, watching Connor walk away, and what collapsed inside her wasn't her heart, because her heart had broken long ago, but the last faint hope that she hadn't been completely wrong, that at least taking care of Wesley hadn't been the wrong choice, that at least one of the 2 children had still been worthy of everything she had given. But now she knew. The child she had given everything to had thrown her away. The child she had given nothing to had picked her up. And that truth destroyed her more completely than any illness Miriam was treating. That night, after the confrontation about Wesley, Connor went up to his room on the 2nd floor and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, not turning on the light, not pouring whiskey, only sitting there. Nero followed him up the stairs as it did every night, its claws tapping against the wooden floor. But when it reached the door of Connor's room, it stopped. It stood at the threshold, its head turned toward the stairs, toward the lower floor, toward Dorothy's room. Then it looked back at Connor. Then it looked toward the stairs again. Connor looked at it. "Come here, Nero." Nero didn't move. For the first time in 5 years, it didn't obey him. Not because it didn't understand, but because it was choosing, and that choice was clear enough to be cruel. It turned its head, walked down the stairs, its claws tapping on each step farther away, each step more distinct, until the sound disappeared, and Connor knew it had gone back to Dorothy's room, had lain beside her bed, was there, and wasn't coming back. Connor sat on the bed, staring at the empty space on the floor where Nero had lain every night for the past 5 years. That empty space was small, less than 1 square meter, but it felt larger than any room he had ever lived in, because it was proof that the only living creature he trusted in this world had just chosen someone else instead of him. And that feeling, the feeling of watching someone walk away toward another person, he knew it. He knew it better than anyone on earth, because he had lived with it since he was 12, when his mother began turning toward Wesley, and now it had returned, not from a human being, but from the dog, the last creature he had believed would never leave him. He lay down, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and in that darkness, he thought about the thing he didn't want to think about. that maybe Nero wasn't abandoning him. Maybe it was doing what dogs often did, going toward the place where it was needed most. And maybe, only maybe, it was teaching him something that 20 years of resentment had never allowed him to learn. That there was something more important than pain, that holding tightly to a wound didn't make him stronger, it only made him lonelier, and that the woman downstairs was slowly dying not only because of illness, but because she had carried her guilt for 20 years, and it was heavier than any sentence he could ever pronounce. He couldn't sleep. The next morning, Miriam called him at 7 o'clock, her voice worried. Nero hasn't eaten since yesterday. I put food in front of it, but it won't touch it. It only lies beside her bed and doesn't move. I think it's sick. Connor knew Nero wasn't sick. He knew that dog better than any creature on earth, and he knew what it was doing. It was refusing to eat because the two people it needed most were on two different floors in the same house, and it wouldn't accept that. He went downstairs, stepped into Dorothy's room, and Nero lifted its head immediately, its tail tapping softly against the floor, the first time it had reacted to anyone since the night before. Dorothy was sitting propped against the pillows, her hand resting on Nero's head, and when Connor walked in, she looked at him but said nothing, because she had learned that in this house, he was the one who spoke first, or no one spoke at all. Connor didn't sit down. He stood in the doorway, his shoulder leaning against the frame, looking at Nero lying in the middle of the floor, its head turned toward her, its tail turned toward him, and he understood that the dog wouldn't eat until both of them were in this room at the same time, because that was what it wanted, not food, but for its world to be whole. The silence stretched on. Then Dorothy spoke, her voice small but not trembling, like someone who had prepared this sentence for a long time and knew this might be the last time she was allowed to say it. That scholarship ceremony. I remember everything. I remember the white shirt tight across your shoulders. I remember you standing at the door looking at me. And I remember that I didn't get up. Connor didn't react, didn't look at her, his eyes still fixed on Nero. Dorothy continued. My mistake wasn't that I loved Wesley. My mistake was that I thought you were strong enough not to need me. I looked at you and saw a tough child, independent, never asking for anything, and I thought that meant you were fine, that you didn't need me as much as Wesley did. And that was the greatest mistake of my life, not because I chose Wesley, but because I assumed your love for me was something that would never run dry, that no matter what I did, you'd still be there, still love me, still wait, and I treated that love as something certain until the day it disappeared with you. The room fell silent. Nero looked at Connor. Connor stood at the door, neither coming farther in nor leaving, standing on the boundary between inside and outside, between staying and walking away, between forgiving and not forgiving, and he knew she was telling the truth, not because she was trying to convince him, but because her voice sounded exactly like it had 20 years ago when she taught him to read honest uncovered, without calculation, only Dorothy speaking to Connor, a mother speaking to her son, as simple as that. He drew in a long breath, and when he spoke, his voice was hoarse, low, almost a whisper. It did run dry, Mom. Then he turned away, stepped into the hallway, and didn't look back. But Dorothy sat on the bed, her hand still resting on Nero's head, and tears slid down her cheeks, not because of the words it did run dry, but because of the final word he had used. Mom. He had called her Mom. For 20 years, he had called her you, had spoken to her with coldness, with distance, and now, in the moment he believed was his cruelest, he had called her by that word again, and maybe he didn't realize he had used it, but she heard it, heard every syllable clearly, and she knew that even if he said the love had run dry, that word, Mom, proved the opposite. Dorothy couldn't sleep that night. She lay staring at the ceiling, her hand stroking Nero's head, and thought about the word Mom that Connor had accidentally let slip, a word both beautiful and painful at the same time, like seeing light fall through the crack of a door into a room she knew she wasn't allowed to enter. She thought about his face when he said it had run dry, about the way his jaw tightened, about the way his hand clenched at his side, and she understood something she had tried to avoid understanding through all the days she had been here, that her presence in this house wasn't healing anything at all. It was only reopening the wound every day, every time he passed her room, every time he heard her voice, every time he saw Nero lying beside her instead of beside him. She was hurting her son again, in another way, And this time she was clear enough to realize it before it was too late. She waited until 4 o'clock in the morning, when the mansion was at its quietest, when the night guard shift changed, and there was a gap that lasted 15 minutes, one she had noticed after many sleepless nights. She sat up slowly, every movement aching, but she gritted her teeth and endured it, because she had endured far worse things on the sidewalk outside. She put on the clean clothes Miriam had given her, the soft shoes someone had placed under the bed, though she didn't know who had bought them, and she stood. Nero lifted its head and looked at her, its eyes bright in the darkness, and she bent down, placed both hands on its face, pressed her forehead to its forehead and whispered, "You stay here. You belong to him. You've always belonged to him. Don't follow me." Then she took the pen and the piece of paper Miriam had left on the bedside table, so she could write down the medicine she needed to take, turned it over, and wrote. Her hand trembled. The letters leaned unevenly, but every word was clear because she had been writing this letter in her mind all night. Connor, I don't deserve to be here. You've done more than anything I had the right to expect from the child I failed. Nero belongs to you, has always belonged to you. I'm the one who didn't choose you, and I have no right to ask you to choose me now. Mom. She placed the paper on the pillow, smoothed it flat, then stepped out of the room. Nero rose to follow her, and she turned back, shaking her head. Stay. Nero looked at her, then at the door, then back at her again, and it whimpered softly, a small sound from deep in its throat, the sound of a creature that understood something terrible was happening but didn't know how to stop it. She walked away, closed the bedroom door, moved down the downstairs hallway, through the kitchen, out the back door that led to the garden, through the small gate she had seen the maintenance staff use every morning, and she stepped into the alley behind the mansion, into the darkness at 4:15 in the morning, a thin 62-year-old woman walking into the city of Chicago without knowing where she would go, only knowing she couldn't stay in a place where her presence cut into her son like a knife every day. 2 floors above, Connor was sleeping, a shallow, broken sleep like every night, and he was awakened not by a sound, but by barking. Nero was barking. Nero almost never barked. In the 5 years he had raised it, he could count the number of times it had barked on the fingers of one hand, because Nero growled, Nero rumbled, but Nero didn't bark, and when it barked, it meant something was very wrong. He sprang up, ran down the stairs, and the barking led him to Dorothy's room. Nero was trapped inside, clawing frantically at the inner side of the door, its nails gouging deep into the polished oak as it barked again and again, desperate to break free and follow the scent it had just lost. Connor opened the door. The room was empty. The bed was empty. Her things were still there, but she was gone. His eyes swept the room and stopped on the paper on the pillow. He picked it up and read it. The letters tilted and trembling, and word by word, he read it to the end. Then he read it again. Then his hand clenched, the paper crumpling in his palm, and he stood there in the empty room, smelling her scent still lingering on the pillow, the cheap soap Miriam had bought, the medicine, the scent of the 62-year-old woman he hadn't wanted to look at a week ago. Yet now the room without her felt so empty he couldn't breathe. Nero bolted out of the room, ran to the back door, then turned and looked at Connor, then ran toward the door again, then looked back once more, and he realized it was leading the way, exactly like the day it had yanked the leash and lunged toward the sidewalk. It knew where she had gone, or at least it would find her, because it had found her once before. Connor grabbed the car keys from the kitchen table, stepped into the hallway, and nearly slammed into Finn, who had heard the barking and come down to check, his eyes still heavy with sleep but his hand already gripping his gun by reflex. Finn looked at Connor's face and said one word, "Boss." Connor answered, and his voice wasn't cold, wasn't flat, wasn't the voice of the boss, but the voice of a man afraid of losing something he had only just realized he didn't want to lose. "Clear everything. I'm going to find my mother." Finn stood there, watching Connor walk out the front door, Nero running beside him, and in 12 years of following the boss, this was the first time he had ever heard Connor Valdez say the words, "my mother," in front of someone else, without trying to hide them, without swallowing them back down, without turning them into anger or contempt, simply saying them, plain and real, as if for the first time he was admitting that he was still someone's son, and that it still mattered. Connor drove out of the mansion, Nero sitting in the passenger seat, its head thrust through the lowered window, its nose drinking in the morning air, and he drove into Chicago at dawn, while the streetlights were still glowing and the streets were still empty, searching for a thin 62-year-old woman trying to disappear again, because she believed disappearing was the best thing she could give him. He drove for nearly 1 hour, through every street Nero reacted to. The window rolled down, the dog's nose drawing in the air again and again, its head turning left when he took the wrong direction, turning right when he needed to change lanes, and Connor followed it because he had no other way. Because every security camera he had access to had failed to catch the image of an old woman walking at 4 o'clock in the morning through streets without cameras, because Abel had men searching. But Chicago was a city of nearly 3 million people, and a homeless old woman was more invisible than a ghost. Nero began to grow agitated when the car passed the area near Harrison Street. It whimpered, clawed at the car door, and when Connor turned onto South Canal Street, it barked once, short and decisive. Connor looked in the direction its nose was pointing and saw the Greyhound bus station, a low gray building with a long awning and rows of plastic seats outside for passengers waiting for early departures. He parked 20 meters from the station, turned off the engine, and looked. Dorothy was sitting on the far right waiting bench, alone, her back slightly bent, her right hand clutching a small plastic bag he didn't know where she had gotten, perhaps picked up somewhere along the road, and inside there was probably nothing but a few odds and ends Miriam had given her. Her eyes were fixed straight ahead, toward the electronic board showing the bus departures. But she wasn't really reading it, because she didn't know where she was going, had nowhere to go, had no one waiting at the other end. She was only sitting there because a bus station was a place for people who were leaving, and she had decided that leaving was the last thing she could do for her son. Nero didn't wait for Connor to open the door. It jumped through the lowered window and charged forward, 70 kilos racing across the parking lot, with enough speed to make 2 passengers smoking nearby startle and step back. It ran straight to Dorothy, stopped in front of her feet, then lay down, placed its head on her soft shoes, and whimpered, a small, long, trembling sound, like the sound of a creature that had found again something it thought it had lost for the second time. Dorothy looked down, saw Nero, and understood at once. If the dog was here, then he was here too. She lifted her head and saw Connor stepping out of the car. He wasn't wearing a suit, wasn't wearing a coat, only a wrinkled black shirt, pulled on in a hurry, dark pants, shoes with the laces still untied. No bodyguards, no weapon, nothing at all, just him. Connor Valdez, 36 years old, standing in the Greyhound parking lot at daybreak, looking like any man in the world and not the Mafia boss all of Chicago feared. He walked toward her, stopped about 3 meters away, and asked, his voice calm but not cold. Not the boss's voice, not the voice of a man giving orders, only the voice of someone asking because he truly wanted to know the answer. Where were you planning to go? Dorothy looked at him, her eyes wet, though she didn't cry. She had promised herself she wouldn't cry in front of him again, because her tears no longer had the right to ask him for anything. Somewhere, I won't bother you. Connor didn't answer right away. He looked at her sitting on the plastic bench at the bus station at dawn, a plastic bag in her hand, waiting for a bus to somewhere no one would be waiting, and in her he saw something he didn't want to see because it looked too much like himself. 20 years earlier, he too had sat on a bench at the bus station on Pulaski Road, his backpack under his head, not knowing where to go, only knowing he couldn't stay. And now she was doing the very same thing. In the same city, on the same kind of plastic seat, with the same loneliness. You've been bothering me for 20 years, he said, and Dorothy flinched softly because she thought he would tell her to come home, or if she wanted to leave, then leave. But not this. Not because you were close, he continued, but because you were far away. Because every time I saw someone on the street with hair like yours, I had to look away. Because every year on my birthday I didn't understand why I hated the smell of chocolate until last week. Because I lived 20 years without a mother, and you think that didn't bother me. Dorothy looked at him, her lips trembling, and she bit down hard to keep her promise not to cry. Connor stepped forward, 1 step, then another, the distance of 3 meters shrinking to 2, then 1. He said, his voice rougher now, lower, closer, I don't forgive you, not yet. Maybe it'll take a very long time. Maybe there'll be days when I look at you, and still see the child standing at the door, waiting for his mother to choose him. But I'm still your son. Whether you chose me or not, I'm still your son, and I won't let your son die in a bus station. Dorothy said nothing. She looked at him standing before her, close enough that she could touch him if she dared lift her hand, and she did the thing she had wanted to do from the day he brought her back to the mansion, but hadn't dared, because she was afraid he would step back. She reached out, slowly, trembling, palm turned upward, not grasping, not pulling, only open, placed in the space between them, letting him choose, to touch or not touch, to take or not take. She wouldn't demand anything. She was only letting him know that this hand was here if he wanted it. Connor looked at that hand, thin, bony, wrinkled, rough from months outdoors. The hand that had once cooked rice for him, once led him across the street, once rested on his head every night, then one day moved to rest on another child's head instead. Nero lifted its head from Dorothy's feet, looked at her hand, looked at Connor's hand hanging at his side, then did the thing only Nero would do. It nudged its nose against Connor's hand, gently, pushing his hand toward Dorothy's. A small nudge, 70 kilos, but light as a feather. And that nudge broke the last thing still holding Connor back. He took his mother's hand. No embrace, no tears, no more words, just held it. His 5 fingers closed around her 5 fingers, tight, certain, and Dorothy felt her son's hand, a hand now much larger than she remembered, rougher, stronger, a hand that had done things she didn't want to know, but still that same hand, the hand of the child who used to hold hers on the way to the market every Saturday morning, and 20 years earlier, he had let go of this hand when he walked through the door of the apartment in West Garfield Park, and today, inside the Greyhound station at dawn, he chose to take it again. They said nothing as they got into the car. There was no need to speak. Dorothy climbed into the back seat slowly, every movement still painful. But unlike the last time, when Connor had lifted her into the car from the sidewalk, this time, she stepped in by herself, sat down by herself, pulled the seatbelt across herself by herself, with trembling hands that belonged to a woman who had chosen to come back, not one who had simply been picked up. Nero jumped onto the back seat right after her, without waiting for an order, without needing anyone to open the door. It climbed in and lay down beside her, placed its heavy head on her lap, and then its tail wagged, softly, slowly. For the first time since the day it had returned to the mansion after 3 vanished weeks, that tail wagged, and Abel wouldn't believe it. Finn wouldn't believe it. No one in the Valdez organization would believe it if someone told them the dog feared by the entire Chicago underworld was wagging its tail in the back seat of a car like a puppy being brought home. But it was true, because Nero wasn't always a symbol of power or a weapon of intimidation. Before all of that, it was only a dog, and a dog needed exactly 2 things, the people it loved and peace. And now it had both in the same car. Connor sat in the driver's seat, started the engine, and drove away from the Greyhound station. He didn't turn on music. He didn't call Finn. He didn't check his messages. He only drove, both hands on the steering wheel, eyes on the road, and now and then, not on purpose, only by instinct, he looked through the rearview mirror. In the mirror, he saw his mother, 62 years old, thin, her gray hair brittle and disheveled, her skin wrinkled, covered with wounds carved into her by time and life and mistakes, sitting in the back seat of his car, in the clean shirt Miriam had given her, wearing the soft shoes someone at the mansion had bought, and her hand was stroking Nero's head, slowly, gently, exactly the way she used to stroke his head every night before he slept, back when he was small, back when she was his entire world, back before everything broke. And he understood, not with reason, because reason was what he had used for 20 years to build walls, to bury things, to turn pain into strength and cruelty. He understood with something deeper, older, something Nero had known 3 weeks earlier when it lay down beside a homeless old woman in a dark alley on the south side and let her stroke its head every night. Some things are abandoned not because they aren't worthy of love, but because the person who loves them has forgotten how to show it. Dorothy didn't abandon him because she didn't love him. She abandoned him because she was exhausted, because she was wrong, because she was human, and human beings make mistakes. And her greatest mistake wasn't the absence of love, but believing that love would be understood even if it was never shown. And he didn't leave because he had stopped loving her. He left because he loved her so much that every time she chose Wesley, it felt like a knife, and he couldn't survive one more cut. Two people loved each other but wounded each other, then lost each other for 20 years. And a dog abandoned in a scrapyard had found them both again, not with words, because it didn't know how to speak, but with the simplest instinct of a creature that knew how to love, moving toward the place where it was needed most. Connor turned onto the familiar road leading back to Lincoln Park. The morning light had grown clearer. Chicago was waking up, traffic beginning to thicken, and in the rearview mirror, she had closed her eyes, her head resting back against the seat, her hand still on Nero's head, while Nero had closed its eyes too, breathing evenly, not growling, not irritable, not fierce, because it didn't need any of that anymore. Growling was the language of pain, and that pain had softened because at last, the two people it loved most in the world were in the same place, in the same car, moving in the same direction, going home. Connor drove through the mansion gate, parked the car, turned off the engine, and sat still for a while. He didn't turn around to look. He didn't need to. He only sat there, both hands still on the steering wheel, listening to his mother's breathing and the dog's breathing blending together behind him. And he thought that maybe this wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. Forgiveness was something larger and longer, and he hadn't reached it yet. But this was a beginning, and a beginning needed only one thing: choosing not to let go. The story of Connor and Dorothy and Nero wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic that could heal 20 years in a single night. But it reminds us that sometimes people don't need to forgive completely before they can love again. They only need to be brave enough to take again the hand they once let go. And sometimes, what pulls us back toward one another isn't an apology or an explanation, but a creature that doesn't know how to speak, only how to love, and to love patiently enough not to give up on either side. If this story touched you, please press like so more people can hear it. Share it with someone you think needs to hear this story today. And subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the stories we bring you every day. We want to know how you feel after hearing this story. Whether it makes you think of anyone in your own life, whether there is a hand you once let go and now wish you could hold again. Write it in the comments below. We read every line and listen to every one of your stories from deep within our hearts. We wish everyone watching this video very good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day. Thank you for being here. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next video.